The snow fell that morning like it had something to hide. Thick, slow, and heavy, it blanketed the ground with a hush so deep it could drown the sound of a breaking heart. No wind, no birdsong, just silence. And in that silence, a woman stood alone. Her name was Clara May. Wrapped in a tattered gray shawl, too thin for the season, she rocked her newborn baby in her arms outside a boarded-up church on the edge of a dying western town. The baby made no sound. He had stopped crying hours ago. His face, swaddled in cloth, was red from the cold. His breath came soft and shallow. But it wasn't just the cold that had driven them out. It was his eyes. The townsfolk called them Apache eyes. Dark, slanted. Proof of betrayal, they said. Proof of sin. Clara never flinched when they spat at her, never answered when they called her a whore or worse. She just held her baby tighter, the only warmth left in her world. Her father had been the first to throw her out. "I'd rather see you dead than bring one of them into this family," he'd shouted, slamming the cabin door on her at dawn, after her son was born on the floor of her childhood room. That was 7 nights ago. She'd walked barefoot through ice for 2 of them, then hitched a ride with a freighter headed west. But by the time she arrived in the town of Dawson Hollow, word had spread like prairie fire. There was no place for a white girl with a half-Apache child. Not in this world. So she'd found the church, the only building with a stoop that gave shelter from the wind, and that's where she stood now, watching snow swallow the last footprints behind her. Claire's eyes were sunken, her lips cracked, her cheeks hollow from nursing the baby while going hungry herself. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her fingers had started turning blue. But she wasn't going to beg. She still had that much pride left. When the church door opened behind her, she turned, heart leaping. A man in a priest's collar stood in the doorway. He looked at her, then the baby, then quietly shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said. "The town council had spoken. I can't shelter you." She didn't answer, just turned back toward the snow.
Inside the saloon down the street, men were playing cards and whispering behind their whiskey. The sheriff leaned against the bar, pretending not to hear them. "That's her," someone said. "That's the one with the Apache brat." Another spat tobacco on the floor. "She should have been stoned at the border." The rancher in the corner said nothing. He just stared out the window, jaw set, hat pulled low over his brow. His coat was worn but clean. His boots bore the dust of travel. His name was Silas Gray, and no one really knew much about him. He'd bought a plot of land outside Dawson Hollow 2 winters ago and came to town once a month for supplies. Never raised his voice, never stayed long. They said he lost a wife once. No one knew how. Some said he served in the war. Some said he rode with scouts. Others said nothing at all, because Silas didn't invite conversation. He was a man who kept his ghosts to himself. But when he stood from the table and walked to the window, eyes fixed on Clara and the baby, something in him shifted. He didn't speak, just watched, then turned and walked out into the snow. Clara didn't hear his footsteps. The wind had started to howl. The baby whimpered, a dry, tired sound. She lowered herself to sit against the church wall, legs numb beneath her. Her arms were too tired to keep holding him, but she did anyway. She was starting to drift. The world grew dim, and her head dropped forward. The snow reached her knees now. And then, warmth. A coat laid over her shoulders, thick, heavy, smelling faintly of cedar smoke and horses. She blinked up into a face shadowed by a brimmed hat. Eyes gray like mountain fog looked back at her without judgment. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. I'm not asking for help." "I know," he said, and that was all. He knelt beside her, picked up the baby with surprising gentleness. Then he helped Clara to her feet. She stumbled, but his hand didn't let go. They didn't speak as he led her down the street, past the silent windows of Dawson Hollow. The townsfolk watched behind curtains and shut their doors.
No one dared stop them, not even the sheriff. Silas helped her into his wagon, wrapped her in a second blanket, and tucked the baby into her arms. Then he climbed onto the driver's bench, clicked his tongue, and turned the horses toward the open plains. Clara didn't know where he was taking them, but for the first time in days, she believed they might live through the night. And for the first time in her life, she realized that silence, real silence, wasn't always empty. Sometimes it meant protection. Sometimes it meant mercy. Sometimes it meant love, long before the word had ever been spoken. The wagon rolled slowly through the night, wheels muffled by snow, hooves thudding steady against the frozen earth. The lantern swayed on its hook, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees as they passed. Inside the wagon bed, Clara sat cradling her son, wrapped in a coat far too large for her, and yet warm enough to stop the shivering in her bones. She didn't know this man, this silent rancher who had lifted her from the edge of death, but she knew one thing for certain. He had not looked away, not when everyone else had. Silas hadn't spoken again after helping her into the wagon. He just drove with that quiet intensity, reins held firm but loose, as if he'd done this journey 1,000 times before, alone. "Where are we going?" she asked once. He didn't answer. Clara didn't ask again. Instead, she looked down at her son, now fast asleep in her arms. The baby's chest rose and fell gently. His little hand peeked from the blanket, fingers curled like petals. She touched them lightly, brushing frostbite away with her breath. He was alive, still alive, and that was all that mattered. By the time they reached the edge of the valley, dawn had begun to bleed into the sky. Pale orange streaked across the horizon, casting the ice-laced branches and making them sparkle. In the clearing ahead, a small cabin stood nestled against the base of the mountain, modest, weather-worn, smoke rising from its crooked chimney. Silas climbed down and opened the door for her, without a word. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wall. The scent of cedar, horsehide, and something simmering in a pot. A fire snapped in the hearth. There were pelts hung on the walls, shelves stacked with canned goods, a table built by hand. Everything felt practical, silent, safe. He gestured toward a cot by the fire. Clara walked slowly, legs still weak, and lay the baby down, tucking him into the wool blanket he'd given her. When she looked up, Silas had placed a chipped ceramic bowl of stew beside her. She stared at it for a long time, not knowing whether to eat or cry. "I didn't mean to bring trouble," she whispered. "You didn't," he said. It was the first thing he'd spoken since leaving town. His voice was rough, low, not unkind, like someone who hadn't used it in a while. "I know what they said about the baby, about me." He didn't respond, but she felt the silence settle gently, like snow resting on an unbroken field. It wasn't the silence of judgment. It was the silence of someone who carried too many stories to speak any one aloud. She glanced at him.
You don't ask much, do you?" He leaned against the mantel, arms crossed. "Your needed fire. That's enough." Clara almost smiled. Almost.
Over the next few days, she began to recover. Her color returned. Her eyes grew brighter. The baby grew stronger, his cheeks rounder, his tiny fingers clenching with life. And Silas, he didn't change, not exactly, but he stayed. He mended a fence in the snow, chopped wood by the barn, milked a single stubborn cow that refused to warm up to anyone but him. He moved with that same quiet efficiency, like every action had a purpose, and no energy could be wasted on words. But still, Clara began to learn him, through silences and glances. He always set her a plate first, even when she said she wasn't hungry. He made sure the baby's blanket stayed warm on colder nights. And once, just once, she saw him pause at the foot of the crib, looking down at the boy with something raw in his eyes, something he didn't want anyone to see. She didn't ask, because Clara had her own ghosts too. Her baby's father, a man who once gave her a carved arrowhead and promised to come back before winter. She'd waited every sunset until the snow came. He never returned. She didn't even know if he was alive. But now, when she thought of love, she didn't think of words. She thought of silence. She thought of a rancher with wind-burned hands building a fire and saying nothing while her son breathed easier. It wasn't long before the rumors came. A traveler, a merchant from Dawson Hollow. He came up the mountain with crates of flour and ammunition, and the second he saw Clara at the cabin door with the baby on her hip, his mouth twisted into disgust. "Lord, have mercy! It's true!" She flinched. He spat in the snow. "You think you're safe up here? The council won't allow this." Silas stepped from the barn, axe in hand. He didn't speak, just stood there, watching. The man paled slightly. "I'm just delivering goods. Don't need trouble." Silas didn't move. The man left quickly. Clara turned to Silas when the wagon had disappeared behind the trees. "They'll come, won't they?" He nodded once. "Then I'll go. I don't want you caught up in this." But he didn't let her finish. He took the baby gently from her arms, checked the blanket, made sure the boy was warm. Then he looked up at Clara and said, "No one's coming for him." "Clara, I buried my wife 3 winters ago," he said quietly. "Her grave is out past the tree line." Clara's breath caught. "I buried my wife, waiting for a child we never had. You think I'm going to let them take yours?" She said nothing. Because what do you say when silence is love? He looked at her for a long time, then turned and walked back into the barn. The wind picked up again, whispering across the ridge. But this time, Clara didn't feel cold. She stood taller, the baby pressed to her chest, a silent fire rising inside her chest. They would come, but she wouldn't be alone when they did.
The storm rolled in quiet, not with thunder or warning, but with a hush that swallowed every sound in the valley. Trees stood still as ghosts. The snow, which had fallen gently all day, thickened like a curtain of ash. By sundown, the mountains had vanished behind walls of white. Clara felt it before she saw it, a knowing deep in her chest, like the ache before tears or the heaviness before heartbreak. She stood by the cabin window, the baby in her arms, staring into the blinding nothingness. Behind her, the fire crackled softly. Silas moved around the room in his usual rhythm, feeding logs to the flames, checking the latch, setting the kettle on the stove. But something in his posture had changed. It was the way he glanced at the rifle above the mantel, the way he stood longer by the door, listening. He knew, too. "They're coming tonight," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas didn't answer, but he picked up the rifle and checked the chamber. She clutched the baby tighter, pressing her cheek against the softness of his head. The child slept soundly, oblivious to the storm outside and the greater one approaching. "Silas," she began, but he raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to steady her, as if to say, "You don't have to speak the fear out loud. I already carry it for you." They arrived after midnight. 6 riders, lanterns swinging in the wind, hooves muffled by snow. Clara saw them first, shadows slicing through the fog like hunters. She stepped back from the window, heart pounding. The baby stirred in her arms. Silas stood outside, already waiting. He hadn't taken shelter inside, hadn't locked the door. He waited in the snow, coat open, rifle at his side, not raised, not threatening, just there. The riders dismounted in silence. One man led. Clara recognized him even through the storm. Sheriff Dalton. Behind him, Luther, the blacksmith, Elias Moore, the preacher, and 3 others from town, wrapped in furs and cruelty. "What is this? You housing them now, Silas?" Silas didn't respond. "You know what she's done." Still nothing. Clara stood inside the doorway, not daring to breathe. She saw Dalton's eyes flick toward the cabin, then lowered to the bundle in her arms. "So it's true. The child's Apache." Silas shifted his weight. "You hiding behind silence again, friend?" Dalton said, voice rising. "This isn't just about some girl now. This is about bloodlines, about what's right." "She's not hurting anyone," Silas said, voice low and even. "Not yet," another man grunted. "And the baby?" Dalton asked. "What then? You going to raise him? Teach him to hate us later?" Silas didn't blink. Clara stepped out onto the porch then, baby wrapped tight to her chest, snowflakes caught in her hair, lips trembling. "I don't want trouble. Just a place to keep him safe." Dalton pointed. "Then leave, tonight, before the sun comes up." "She won't survive that," Silas said. Dalton shrugged. "Not my concern."
"You make it mine," Silas said quietly. "Then I'll answer." The wind howled then, like the mountain was watching. Dalton took a step forward, hand resting on his holster. "I buried my wife 3 winters back," Silas said, "next to a cradle that never got used." The words dropped like stones. He hadn't planned to speak them. They just came, worn and broken and full of ache. And now this woman and her child show up at my door, half dead, frozen, and all I can think is, maybe this is what's left of grace in the world. He paused. "I don't care what you think of me, but if you try to take them, you'll have to put me in the ground first." The snow fell harder. None of the men moved. Dalton stared at him long and hard. "Damn fool," the sheriff muttered. "You always did carry ghosts." Then he turned his horse without a word. The others hesitated. One man lingered, but Luther touched his arm. "Let's go," he said. "Ain't no winning against a man who's already lost enough." By dawn, they were gone. The storm passed. The world turned pale and still again. Silas came inside, boots soaked, coat dusted in white. Clara sat at the table, eyes wide, hands trembling.
He poured her coffee, sat across from her. "You were willing to die for us," she whispered. He looked at her, eyes quiet. "No," he said. "I was willing to live with you." The words weren't grand, they weren't poetic, but they broke something open inside her, like spring cracking through ice. And for the first time since the baby's father vanished into the desert, Clara felt something stir beneath the grief. Not hope exactly, but the shape of it. A beginning. The weeks passed, slow and tender, like a wound learning how to close. Snow melted from the eaves, trees stirred in their sleep, and the silence that had once wrapped the cabin like a shroud became something gentler, like the hush of prayer, not fear. Clara was no longer a visitor in the house. She knew where the spoons were. She stoked the fire without asking. She'd taken to hanging baby clothes on a line out back, pinning tiny shirts with steady hands, even when the wind snapped them like flags. She had begun to hum, quiet lullabies passed down from her mother, words sung in Spanish and sometimes just breathed because she didn't always remember the lyrics. The child, now 5 months old, had learned to smile. His eyes, those unmistakable Apache eyes, gleamed beneath his mother's lashes, and sometimes, when the sun hit them just right, Silas would pause mid-task to look. He never said anything, but Clara noticed the way his grip on the axe handle softened, how he lingered a moment longer than usual before turning away. It was subtle, but when a man like Silas pauses, it's louder than shouting. One morning, as spring finally pushed its fingers through the frost, Clara found a small carved wooden horse by the baby's crib. Its legs were rough, uneven, clearly handmade. She picked it up and turned it in her palm. There were initials burned into the belly. S.L. Silas had made it. Probably at night. Probably while the child slept. She didn't ask him why, but that night she placed it gently between the baby's hands, and when he gripped it with a squeal of joy, she caught Silas watching from the doorway, not smiling, but softer than she'd ever seen him. Then came the hawk. It arrived one dawn, circling the cabin before landing on the fence post, like a spirit come to deliver news. She froze as she stepped outside, her breath catching. The bird was familiar, dark wings, white crest. "I've seen that hawk before," she murmured. Silas stepped beside her. "It followed him," she said, "the baby's father, when we met in the canyon. He said it was a sign." "Of what?" She turned to him. "Of someone watching, someone who sees beyond blood." The hawk let out a single cry and then rose into the air and vanished toward the southern ridge. Clara stood silent a long moment, then whispered, "He's alive." Silas didn't ask how she knew, because sometimes grief has a voice, and sometimes it turns into belief.
3 days later, it happened. A knock at the door. Not heavy, not urgent. Just a quiet knock, as if someone wanted to be sure he was welcome before he entered a world that had already moved on. Silas opened the door. The man outside was young, weather-worn, a long scar down one cheek, dressed in buckskin, hair braided and tied with a feather the same color as the hawk's wings. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, clutching a satchel, eyes moving past Silas and into the house, until they landed on Clara. She dropped the bowl in her hand. "Joaquin," she breathed. He stepped in slowly, his boots barely making a sound on the wood. "Clara," he said. His voice cracked. "I came back. I never stopped." She rushed to him, trembling, baby still in her arms. They didn't fall into each other like stories say. They just stood close, forehead to forehead, as the child pressed between them, a bridge, a weight, a living proof. "I couldn't find you," Joaquin whispered. "The white men, your town, said you'd vanished. I thought." "I almost did," she said. "But someone found me." They turned together then, toward Silas. He hadn't moved from the doorway. Joaquin looked at him, truly looked, and his expression changed. Not jealousy, not mistrust. Gratitude. "He kept you safe," he said. Clara nodded. Joaquin stepped forward, hand outstretched. Silas stared for a moment, then took it. Two men, one silent, one scarred, both shaped by loss, standing together not as rivals, but as something rarer. Men who loved the same soul and chose peace. Later that night, Clara sat by the fire, the child nestled between her and Joaquin. Silas stood at the edge of the room, as always, present but quiet. Joaquin looked at him. "I have land south of the Red River. The tribe gave it to me. Trees, water, even wild horses sometimes." Silas said nothing. "You're welcome to come, if you want." The invitation hung in the air. Clara looked from one man to the other, her heart a knot of history and healing. "I wouldn't be here if not for both of you," she said softly. Silas nodded once. "I'll help you pack," he said. And just like that, they knew. The next chapter wouldn't be written in solitude. It would be a trail they rode together, however far, however hard. Because sometimes, love doesn't ask to be chosen. Sometimes, it just stays, long enough for someone else to find their way back.
They left the cabin at dawn. No one said much. There was only the quiet rhythm of hooves on soft dirt, the creak of leather, and the cry of a bluebird somewhere in the cottonwoods. Clara rode in the middle, her son swaddled tightly to her chest. Joaquin rode ahead, eyes on the trail. Silas followed behind, silent as always, the wide-brimmed hat low on his brow, rifle strapped to his back, not for war, but protection. The world was green now. Spring had painted it with mercy. The snow that once tried to claim her life had long since melted, and the same land that spat her out months before now seemed to whisper forgiveness with every breeze. But not everyone had forgotten. By midday, when they reached the outskirts of Gray Ridge, the nearest trading town, eyes followed them. A white woman riding beside a native man with a child on her breast whose skin was dusk-kissed and eyes sharp like the desert sky. Silas saw the sheriff first. He sat on the porch of the general store, thumbs hooked in his belt, chewing something bitter. "Miss Clara," he said, not unkindly, not kindly either. "You passin' through?" She met his gaze, firm, not frightened. "Yes." He looked toward the baby, then to Joaquin, then finally to Silas. And maybe it was the man's silence that unnerved him most. "Folks round here ain't so forgivin'," the sheriff muttered. Clara didn't flinch. She only said, That's why we're not staying." And they rode on.
By nightfall, they reached a ridge that overlooked the Red River Valley. Below was Joaquin's land, untamed, vast, edged by trees and soft hills. A river shimmered like silver in the moonlight, winding through it like a ribbon dropped by the sky. "This is it," Joaquin said. "Home." Clara dismounted slowly, legs stiff, eyes wide. She looked at the land as if she was afraid to breathe, like it might vanish if she hoped too hard. The baby stirred in her arms, let out a soft coo. Silas climbed down last. He walked to the edge of the ridge, looked down at the valley, and said nothing. Then he turned to Clara. "I built something for him," he said, and reached into his saddlebag. It was another carved toy, a small horse, but this time polished, smoothed, even painted. Apache eyes. Clara took it, tears pricking her eyes before she could stop them. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You already did," Silas said, and touched the child's cheek gently, just once, like a man leaving behind something holy. That night they lit a fire under the stars. No walls, no towns, just sky and dust and open forgiveness. Joaquin sang to the child in Apache, his voice low and ancient, and the baby fell asleep between them. Clara leaned her head on Joaquin's shoulder, hand still holding the toy horse. She looked across the flames at Silas, who sat just beyond the light, whittling something unseen. "You could stay," she said, her voice tentative. He looked up. "I mean it. There's enough land for 3 cabins, or 1, whatever you want." He gave the faintest smile. "I'll come by from time to time," he said, "if the horses need breaking." Clara nodded. It wasn't a no. It was a beginning.
Months later, people would say there was a strange little ranch on the southern edge of the river valley, run by a native, a woman with fire in her spine, and a silent cowboy who came and went like the wind. They'd say a boy with dark eyes grew up there, fast and wild and kind, that he learned to ride before he could walk, that he carved horses just like the man who brought him his first. Some swore they'd seen a hawk circling above that land, always watching, never far. And sometimes, on cold nights, if you walked by the ridge at just the right time, you could hear 3 voices in the wind. One deep and strong, one scarred and singing, and one small and laughing with Apache eyes. In the West, bullets travel fast, but love, if it's real, will always find its way back, even if it has to ride alone through 100 winds of dust.